I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now, no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything. Today, Friday, January 9th, is a very bad day for Sean Combs because Netflix just dropped what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of The Reckoning. There was no countdown, no flashy trailer pushed for weeks. It just appeared. And when something arrives that quietly, people don't lean back. They lean in, because silence like that usually means the people involved already know what's coming. This isn't framed as a sequel meant to entertain. It feels like a continuation meant to unsettle. A reminder that the first release wasn't an ending, just a pause. What's important here isn't shock, it's timing. The original series landed when the public was still processing headlines, courtrooms, and speculation. This release lands when attention has slowed, when most people assume the story had settled. That's not accidental. Stories hit hardest when people stop bracing for them. And that's exactly what makes today feel different. 50 Cent isn't presenting this as a takedown. He's presenting it as context. Footage that didn't fit before. Conversations that were never meant to be replayed together. Visuals and timelines that only feel heavy once you see how often the same names, places, and moments overlap. Nothing is shouted. Nothing is labeled. And that's what makes viewers uneasy. When something doesn't tell you how to feel, you start feeling it anyway. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell because this story is moving fast. And what happens next won't be announced loudly. What stands out immediately is restraint. This isn't a montage of accusations. It's proximity. Who was around, when they were around, how often the same circles close in on themselves. Jay-Z's name, for example, isn't framed as a headline. It appears through association, through shared spaces and moments that were always public but never line up side by side. That's why reactions are split. Some people see nothing new. Others suddenly see patterns they can't unsee. This release doesn't ask for verdicts. It doesn't claim to prove crimes. It does something more uncomfortable. It removes distance. It challenges the idea that time alone resolved anything. And when viewers realize this isn't about one person, but about how silence protected entire ecosystems, the tension shifts. Because once silence stops feeling neutral, every old moment starts to feel heavier. And once that happens, the story doesn't need to escalate. It just needs to exist. That's why today matters. Not because everything changed overnight, but because whatever was unfinished just stepped back into the room. What makes this chapter feel heavier isn't that it claims to reveal something explosive. It's that it refuses to rush past anything. The pacing slows on purpose. Moments are allowed to sit. Clips aren't cut for drama. They're left just long enough for you to notice what normally gets edited out. The pauses, the glances, the way conversations drift away from clarity right when they get close to it. This is a story about one clip changing everything. It's about how nothing ever changed because nothing was ever fully addressed. As the footage unfolds, a pattern starts forming without being announced. The same environments keep appearing, the same social circles, the same moments where questions had been closed but weren't not denied, not explained, just left open. And open questions don't disappear. They linger, especially when time has passed and the same names keep resurfacing in different contexts, different years, different headlines, yet always connected by proximity rather than explanation. What's unsettling is how familiar it all feels once you see it lined up. None of this is framed as new information. It's framed as remembered information. Things people saw once, shrugged at, and moved on from because the moment didn't feel urgent back then. But urgency isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives late when distance collapses and everything sits side by side. That's when memory stops being passive and starts becoming analytical. This chapter leans into that discomfort. It doesn't accuse. It observes. It lets repetition do the talking. How often the same faces appear without context? How often silence follows moments that should have led somewhere? How often the industry relied on time to smooth edges instead of clarity to close loops? The power here isn't in revelation. It's an alignment. When separate moments finally touch, they change each other. And once you notice that alignment, it's hard to go back to consuming these stories the old way. You stop asking what happened and start asking why nothing followed, why explanations were always postponed, why distance was allowed to become the answer. Silence in this light doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels intentional, not sinister, strategic. That's why reactions are so divided. Some viewers see nothing but familiar footage. Others feel something shift, because this isn't about proof. It's about pressure. Pressure created when unfinished stories are no longer allowed to stay unfinished simply because time passed. Pressure created when the audience stops rushing and starts watching. And that pressure doesn't need to explode to matter. It just needs to remain. What quietly changes here is how responsibility is framed. Not as guilt, not as innocence, but as presence. Who was always around when moments went unexplained? Who stayed visible when things were comfortable, and who faded when clarity would have required more than a sentence? This chapter doesn't push accusations forward. It pulls context backward. It asks you to look again at moments you were told were finished, and notice how little was actually resolved. You start to realize how much of the industry runs on fragments. A clip without the full conversation. A headline without the follow-up. An interview that promises answers later and later never comes. On their own, each fragment feels harmless. Together, they feel deliberate. Not because someone planned chaos, but because no one felt pressure to complete the story. Completion was never required when reputation could carry the weight. This is where attention shifts from personalities to systems. Systems that reward silence more than explanation. Systems that understand how quickly outrage burns out and how reliably time smooths discomfort. The documentary doesn't need to say this out loud. It shows it through repetition. The same deflections, the same half answers, the same calm confidence that nothing needs to be clarified because nothing ever was before. What makes this uncomfortable is how normal it all looks. No panic, no scrambling, just a steady reliance on distance. Distance between events, distance between questions and responses, distance between what the audience saw and what they understood. That distance once felt like maturity. Now it feels like insulation. As viewers, you're not being asked to take sides. You're being asked to notice behavior. Who engages deeply and who stays surface level. Who explains fully and who lets time answer for them. These patterns don't accuse anyone. They reveal priorities, and priorities tell their own story. The longer this plays out, the clearer one thing becomes. Silence wasn't a gap. It was a method, a way to let moments pass without closure, trusting that memory would fade faster than curiosity. But memory didn't fade. It stacked. And stacked moments eventually stop feeling coincidental. This is where the tension grows. Not through shock, but through recognition. Recognition that power doesn't always hide facts. It manages interpretation. And once interpretation slips out of control, even familiar footage starts to feel different, heavier. Not because it proves something new, but because it refuses to disappear. That's a shift happening now. Not louder, just deeper. By this point, something subtle has already shifted in how the story is being processed. The focus isn't on what was just shown. It's on what it forces you to remember. Old interviews, old moments, old reactions that once felt complete suddenly feel unfinished. Not because new information appeared, but because the same answers keep repeating while the questions quietly change. And when answers don't evolve, they start to feel rehearsed rather than reassuring. What becomes impossible to ignore is how often clarity was almost offered, almost explained, almost addressed, then gently redirected. That pattern shows discipline, not fear, not chaos. Discipline in knowing when not to speak, when to let reputation speak instead, when to trust that familiarity will calm curiosity. That strategy worked for years because people consume moments separately. A clip here, a headline there. No one was encouraged to line them up. This time they are. And when moments are placed side by side, the tone matters more than the words. The pauses, the timing, the way responsibility is acknowledged just enough to appear present, but never enough to create a record. Silence here doesn't feel like restraint anymore. It feels like design. Designed to keep stories open-ended, so they never demand conclusion, because conclusions create accountability. Open endings create comfort. This is where attention stops moving forward and starts circling back. Not aggressively, calmly, patiently. Viewers aren't waiting for a bombshell now. They're watching behavior. Who engages when the conversation is safe? Who disappears when isn't? Who explains details and who relies on time to smooth the edges? That quiet observation is far more destabilizing than outrage because it doesn't burn out. It accumulates. And once accumulation begins, silence stops being neutral. It becomes part of the story itself. At this stage, the story stops feeling like it's moving forward and starts feeling like it's tightening. Not because new names are introduced, but because the same ones keep reappearing in places that were never fully explained. Familiar settings, familiar faces, familiar moments that once felt disconnected now sit uncomfortably close together. And when proximity replaces distance, interpretation changes. What stands out is how often opportunity for clarity existed. Moments where a fuller explanation would have ended speculation. Moments where context could have settled everything. Instead, those moments pass quietly, replaced by movement. A new project, a new headline, a new distraction. Movement became the substitute for resolution. And for a long time, that worked. People assumed progress meant closure. It didn't. This chapter leans into that realization without dramatizing it. It lets you sit with how many times stories were redirected rather than resolved. How often conversations ended not with answers but with transitions, a change of subject, a shift in tone, a reliance on legacy to fill the gaps. Legacy is powerful that way. It doesn't argue, it reassures. And reassurance can be enough when people aren't looking closely. But looking closely is exactly what's happening now. Viewers aren't asking for instant conclusions. They're tracking consistency. Does the response today align with the response years ago? Does the tone change when the question changes? Does silence appear at the same pressure points every time? These aren't accusations. They're measurements. And measurement removes ambiguity. What makes this uncomfortable is that nothing here feels accidental, not sinister, intentional. Intentional pacing, intentional distance, intentional reliance on time as a buffer. Silence isn't used to hide everything. It's used to avoid explaining the parts that matter most. And when that pattern becomes visible, it doesn't need confirmation to feel real. It explains itself through repetition. This is a point where the audience stops waiting for answers and starts evaluating absence. Absence of explanation, absence of follow-up, absence of closure, and absence when repeated becomes presence. It becomes a signal that something was never meant to be finished publicly. That unfinished feeling doesn't demand outrage. It demands attention. And attention, once it settles in like this, doesn't leave easily. By now, the tension isn't coming from what's being shown. It's coming from what's being withheld. Not withheld as secrecy, but withheld as explanation. The footage exists. The moments are real. The timelines are visible. What's missing is a connective tissue that would turn fragments into a finished story. And the absence of that connection starts to feel louder than any reveal ever could. This is where the audience's role quietly changes. Viewers stop consuming and start comparing. They remember how certain questions were answered years ago and how similar questions are handled now. The language sounds familiar. The calm tone, the emphasis on moving forward, the refusal to slow down long enough to unpack anything fully. That consistency is telling, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it reveals habit. Habit is powerful. It doesn't react. It repeats. And repetition creates comfort for the people inside the system, not for the people watching it from the outside. From the outside, repetition begins to look like avoidance. Not avoidance out of fear, but avoidance out of confidence. Confidence that nothing needs to be clarified because nothing ever was before. What's unsettling is how effective that confidence has been. Not because audiences were fooled, but because they were trained. Trained to accept silence as professionalism. Trained to see distance as dignity. Trained to believe that if something truly mattered, someone else would have addressed it already. That assumption carried a lot of weight for a long time. But assumptions don't hold up under sustained attention. And sustained attention is what this moment creates. Not outrage-driven, not impatient, methodical. Viewers aren't demanding explanations anymore. They're noting the lack of them. They're observing how often clarity is postponed, how frequently time is allowed to stand in for truth. And once that observation sets in, silence stops working the way it used to, because silence depends on forgetting. And forgetting isn't happening here. This is where the pressure becomes quiet, but constant. No accusations shouted, no conclusions forced, just a steady awareness that certain stories were never meant to be completed publicly. And once that awareness exists, every future pause carries meaning. Every non-response feels intentional. Every gap becomes part of the narrative. The story doesn't need to escalate now. It's already anchored. At this stage, something subtle but important has already shifted. The story is no longer about whether new footage exists or how shocking it might be. It's about behavior, about how people move when attention stops being temporary and starts becoming sustained. Because power isn't tested when eyes glance at it once. It's tested when those eyes don't look away. What stands out now is how carefully everything is paced. Not rushed, not denied, just measured. Statements that acknowledge without explaining. Appearances that reassure without clarifying. A presence that feels controlled, almost rehearsed. That kind of discipline doesn't come from chaos. It comes from experience. From knowing that the safest move has always been to let time do the work. But time isn't working the same way anymore. The audience isn't reacting in bursts. They're settling in. They're rewatching. They're placing old moments next to new ones and noticing how often the same instincts appear, the same pauses, the same deflections, the same comfort with leaving things unresolved. And when repetition becomes visible, it stops feeling accidental. This is where the tension deepens, not explodes. Because nothing dramatic has happened on screen. No moment that forces a verdict. No statement that closes a book. Just a growing awareness that closure was never the goal. Control was control over pacing. Control over focus. Control over when a story is allowed to feel over. What's uncomfortable is realizing how normal that once felt. How silence was interpreted as strength. How distance was read as maturity. How unfinished stories were accepted as complete simply because enough time had passed. That logic only works when people move on. They didn't. Now, every quiet moment adds weight instead of removing it. Every delay feels logged. Every absence feels noted. Not emotionally, mentally. And mental tracking is dangerous for systems built on patience, outlasting curiosity. Because curiosity didn't burn out this time. It stabilized. This is the point where the story no longer needs new information to stay alive. It feeds on consistency, on watching the same strategies reappear, on noticing how often explanation is available but not chosen. That choice becomes a message. And once people recognize that, the silence stops protecting anything. It starts defining it. From here on, nothing has to be said for the story to continue moving. The audience already knows how to listen. By now, the story has moved past curiosity and into recognition. Not recognition of guilt, recognition of structure, of how moments were handled, delayed, softened, and spaced apart so they never collided. Because once moments collide, patterns form, and patterns don't argue, they don't exaggerate. They just sit there and wait to be noticed. What makes this phase different is that nothing new has to happen for the pressure to grow. The archive already exists. Old interviews, old appearances, old reactions that once felt complete now feel partial, not wrong, just unfinished. And unfinished things carry weight when people stop rushing past them. This is where silence changes meaning. It no longer reads as discipline or restraint. It reads as a choice, a repeated one. And repetition is what turns behavior into a signal. When the same response appears again and again under different circumstances, it stops being coincidence. It becomes habit. And habit reveals design. The audience isn't asking louder questions. They're asking steadier ones. Questions that don't demand immediate answers. Questions that simply remain unanswered. And unanswered questions don't fade when attention is patient. They mature. They deepen. They turn into quiet reference points that follow every new moment. This is why timing matters more than statements. Now, when responses arrive quickly for some topics and slowly for others, people notice. When clarity appears where it's convenient and disappears where it requires context, people notice, not emotionally, systematically. What's unsettling is how calm everything remains. No panic, no urgency, just the same measured distance that worked before. But distance only works when people stop measuring it, and they aren't stopping. The story isn't escalating, it's settling. And settled stories don't disappear. They become background pressure. The kind that doesn't scream but doesn't leave either. The kind that changes how every future move is interpreted. Because now every silence adds information. Every pause becomes part of the record. Every non-response communicates just as clearly as a statement would have. And that's the shift. Silence is no longer empty space. It's content. At this stage, the power dynamic quietly flips. The narrative no longer controls the audience. The audience controls the memory. And memory doesn't reset just because nothing happened today. It waits. At this point, the question isn't what will be revealed next. The question is what happens when nothing is revealed at all. Because silence, when it stretches as long, stops feeling neutral and starts feeling deliberate. And deliberate silence changes how every past moment is understood. People are no longer watching for shock. They're watching for consistency. They're comparing reactions across time. Not what was said, but when it was said. Not who spoke, but who didn't. And when you line those moments up, something subtle becomes clear. The same pauses appear at the same pressure points every time. That's not drama. That's pattern. What makes this uncomfortable is an accusation. It's alignment. Old interviews suddenly sound cautious in the same places. Old answers feel rehearsed around the same topics. Old moments that once felt harmless now feel strategically incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. And incompleteness is powerful because it lets people assume the rest was handled privately. It lets stories fade without closure. It lets time replace explanation. But time stopped doing that job. The audience changed. They don't forget the way they used to. Clips don't disappear. Context doesn't get buried. Everything sits side by side now instead of being spread out across decades. And when things sit side by side, gaps show up. Those gaps don't accuse anyone of anything. They accuse the process. They point to how attention was managed, how questions were redirected, how clarity was delayed until it no longer felt necessary. That's why this moment feels heavy without being loud. Nothing new needs to be added. The weight comes from accumulation, from realizing how often the same strategy worked and how rarely it was questioned. Silence used to be interpreted as control. Now it's interpreted as calculation. And calculation invites scrutiny, not outrage. Scrutiny doesn't burn out. It stays. Every future appearance will be filtered through this awareness. Every statement measured against what wasn't said before. Every pause compared to earlier pauses. And once that comparison starts, it doesn't stop. This isn't about endings. It's about permanence. Once people notice how the story was handled, they can't unsee it. The narrative doesn't collapse. It freezes into place, and frozen narratives don't go away. They wait,